Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today
Con
at the
ustedes
regional
hoy
briefing on
con el
armed
briefing
conflict and
regional
sexual violence.
sobre conflictos armados y violencia sexual. Yo soy
I'm the
Renata
head of the
Dalaqua.
Gender and
Yo soy
Disarmament Program at
al
UNIDIR,
jefe
the
del
UN
programa
Institute
de
for Disarmament
disarmamento.
Research. Um, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to this regional briefing with a focus on Latin American and Caribbean states. So at UNIDIR, we've been doing this event, this briefing region by region. And we are very pleased to have with us participants today who are working in the Latin American Caribbean region or representing Latin American Caribbean states in multilateral fora. This event today is co-organized with another UNIDIR project, which is the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project, MEAC for short. So very happy about this collaboration as well. Today's event is an opportunity for us from UNIDIR to share with you latest research on the linkages between increased militarization, the proliferation of weapons, and sexual and gender-based violence, and then also get your views and your feedback. As we know, sexual and gender-based violence are pervasive in the context of armed conflict, and it can also persist even after a conflict has ended. And sexual violence coupled with impunity can even drive victims to join armed groups and continue the cycle of violence. This is an issue of public health and social development, but it's certainly a concern also for the arms control and disarmament community. If weapons are used to commit rape in war, then clearly arms control and disarmament measures should play a role in prevention strategies. To discuss these issues, we have gathered some of UNIDIR researchers. We will kick off our discussion with a presentation by my colleague Hana Salama. Hana will provide us with an overview of the linkages between weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. And this will be followed by a presentation from Sofia Rivas, who will share insights from empirical research carried out with people affected by armed conflict. These presentations will be followed by a Q&A, where we'd like to hear from you on further areas for dialogue, for research, for action. And we're really hoping this is going to be an interactive meeting. So during the Q&A portion, you will be, welcome to take the floor, to raise your hand, or throughout the conversation, throughout the presentations, you can use the chat function and write to us if you have comments or questions. I'd like to say that this meeting is being recorded. It will be posted on UNIDIR's YouTube channel afterwards. And also that we have interpretation available into Spanish. So if you would like to listen to the conversation in Spanish, you can do so by using the interpretation function on Zoom. And when we come to the Q&A segment, you can also ask questions in Spanish if you would prefer. Unfortunately, we don't have interpretation to Portuguese, but if anyone would like, we can also find a way of doing that. I can be the interpreter if needed. But that's it from me now. I would like to give the floor to my colleague Hana for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Renata, and thank you again, everyone, for joining. It's really a pleasure to be here with our colleagues, also from the Managing Exits Out of Armed Conflict. And as Renata mentioned, today I will be presenting our research from the Gender and Disarmament Program on the linkages between the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. But before we kick off, I just wanted to introduce the Gender and Disarmament Program for those of you who have not come across us before. So at the Gender and Disarmament Program at UNIDIR, we analyze the gendered impacts of armed violence and examine how gender norms shape the role of weapons in society. We do this by carrying out research, dialogue, and capacity building activities to contribute to gender equality and really to improve women's participations in all areas and all discussions around international security, including arms control and disarmament. We really think that by translating gender awareness into action, we can help ensure that arms control and disarmament delivers for everyone. And this work wouldn't be possible without our generous donors. And I'd like to thank them and mention them here. They are for this year, Canada, Germany, Ireland, Malta, and Norway. So moving on to the meat of the issue. As you all know, conflict-related sexual violence is a complex phenomenon which has multiple overlapping causes and enabling factors, some of which are rooted in the conflict itself, but really its root cause is gender inequality. Among the enabling factors facilitating and fueling systematic and widespread sexual violence in conflict is the proliferation of weapons, and specifically small arms and light weapons. I particularly highlight small arms and firearms because they are the weapon of choice in conflict and specifically by armed groups involved in civil wars or internal armed conflict. And this is because they are very widespread, they're relatively cheap and easy to transport, also traffic and conceal. And this has been recognized by the UN Secretary General, including the fact that increased militarization and proliferation of small arms and light weapons in conflict is a factor which fuels sexual violence. But beyond this recognition, however, little has been done to look at, first of all, what are the empirical linkages and evidence to link these phenomenon together, and also what can be done as part of CRSV preventions to leverage arms control and disarmament and support the prevention of CRSV. So our research really addressed these two questions. We wanted to know how the proliferation of small arms is linked to CRSV and also identify entry points where arms control, disarmament treaties, instruments, tools, and measures can be leveraged for prevention. Now I'd like to share the key findings of this study, which was published in 2023, but is available on our website. And if we can kindly move to the next slide, please. The report found that that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in conflict can be linked to CRSV in two ways. First, directly, as weapons and ammunition are used by perpetrators to commit rape, threaten, or coerce individuals into sexual acts against their will, injure and kill survivors and victims of sexual violence. Second, there are indirect links, as weapons proliferations contribute to fueling armed conflict, which in turn propagates the conditions that lead to not only conflict-related sexual violence, but also gender-based violence in a conflict. What we found on the direct links is that there is very limited data. And most of the data referred to armed actors and as the perpetrators, but they didn't necessarily identify weapons or the type of weapons. We did find in the DRC, in the conflict-affected areas, that hospitals such as the Panzi Hospital, which is a specialized hospital for treating survivors of sexual violence, and MSF hospitals did indicate, their data did indicate that between 40 and 60% of incidents of CRSV involved a weapon. We did also find one data set from a civil society organization called Insecurity Insight, which identified firearms specifically as part of CRSV incidents. So according to Insecurity Insight in 2022, between 70 to 90% of CRSV incidents that were recorded in 6 countries involved a firearm. And these countries were DRC, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, and Ukraine. On the indirect links, we also found some evidence from studies in South Sudan and DRC that showed that the same conditions that led to increasing conflict violence, for example, the proliferation of weapons and militarization, also led to an increase in intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And a recent example of this is in Ukraine, where the UN has not only documented many cases of conflict-related sexual violence that were facilitated by weapons, but also local CSOs in Ukraine documented an increase of domestic and intimate partner violence. And it was quite a shocking statistic. So in terms of calls to the police, increased by 400% in the period of January 2023 as compared to the period of time in January 2022. And in addition to the direct and indirect links between small arms and sexual violence, we also interviewed practitioners in the field and who work at UN peace operations, and they help reveal additional links where we think more research is needed to unpack those links. So, for example, the link between criminal groups who take advantage of the conflict and the breakdown of borders and the rule of law for their financial gain when they are trafficking women and children for the purposes of sexual exploitation, as well as trafficking weapons. So these things can be done in parallel or together. Some interviewers also pointed to the fact that some groups, when they are doing cross-border trafficking of weapons, may be using sexual violence to coerce women into trafficking roles. And in addition, our interviews from the DRC revealed that in areas controlled by armed groups, such as the mining areas in particular, where the groups were trafficking minerals and also using this money to purchase weapons, there were high levels of sexual violence. Now, based on these linkages, the paper proposes an arms control and disarmament toolbox for both the long-term and the short-term prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. So this toolbox, it's a conceptual, but it's really underpinned by the treaties today, which address legal and policy frameworks around small arms control. And these are the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, the Firearms Protocol, and just to give you an example of how they can support long-term and structural prevention, the ATT, for example, can be used and is one of the most important treaties, as it's the first legally binding treaty to explicitly prohibit state parties to export arms in countries where there are widespread violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses. And we all know that CRSV can be considered an IHL violation and is definitely a human rights abuse. So it's covered under Article 6. And in addition to this, the ATT has an additional Article 7.4, which specifically requires states to conduct risk assessments on the possibilities that weapons can be used to commit and facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence. And here, I think we can all agree that sexual violence in conflict is a serious act of GBV. So CRSV is really covered by 2 articles in the ATT. So this can really prevent weapons to perpetrators and prevent the flow of weapons, especially in the long term. But our toolbox also has some measures that can support short-term prevention. And if we move to the next slide, we can see that these measures can be relevant at different phases of a conflict to limit access of weapons to perpetrators of sexual violence and to armed groups. Thus, they can be really useful for short-term and operational prevention. And UNIDIR has some upcoming research looking specifically at these what we call tools and measures. So arms embargoes, community violence reduction, DDR, and weapons and ammunition management, how they are used in the context of UN peace operations, and how they can be better leveraged to support the prevention of CRSV. So there is more to come on this topic from UNIDIR. And just to conclude, I think that the report brought light and awareness to the linkages between small arms and light weapons, but there is still a need to continue to improve our understanding of these linkages between small arms and sexual violence through enhanced data collection and specifically disaggregated data on the demographic information of the perpetrator, but also the victim, and importantly, disaggregated by type of weapon. And this data can help us better bring awareness to the linkages in small arms control forums, in meetings, such as the Conference of State Parties of the ATT, or the review conferences for the UN Program of Action. And here we can really start discussing implementation of these treaties in a gender responsive way using this evidence. And finally, one of our, most important findings is the fact that survivors and survivors associations should be included in arms control and disarmament at all levels. These often include women, as women are the primary victims of CRSV, but they are often excluded from decision making, especially at the national level or even at the community level. And much more efforts need to be done to bring survivors organizations, for example, to disarmament campaigns or to meeting discussing small arms control. So to conclude, what we know is that arms control and disarmament is relevant for preventing CRSV, and tools such as DDR, SSR, community violence reduction, and weapons and ammunition management are being implemented by different actors in conflict situations. However, they're not being done in a gender responsive way. And we are, as UNIDIR, we're committed to do further research in this area and ensure that we have practical recommendations whereby these efforts can prevent CRSV. And for us, this is really important because we believe that a gender perspective and a gender responsive approach can contribute to changing gender norms and attitudes by promoting women's participation in decision making about security issues, including in arms control, and thereby not only addressing the short-term risks, but also addressing structural gender inequality. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions, and I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Sofia.
Thank you, Hana. So as Renata said earlier, my name is Sofia Rivas, and I'm an associate researcher for the MAX, or Managing Exits from Armed Conflict project at UNIDIR. On this first slide, you can see some of our partners and donors for the project. And today I'm going to be focusing specifically on the Colombian case study of the MAC project. I'm going to be presenting the findings of a report that we recently published by the Colombian case study of the MAC project on the relationship between sexual violence and conflict involvement, based on a case study of the Nasa indigenous community in northern Cauca, Colombia. So in general terms, the research analyzes whether the indigenous justice system of the Nasa community in northern Cauca successfully addresses cases of sexual violence, and if not, whether failures in the system may be driving some survivors of sexual violence to join armed groups in the region in search for justice. This research comes at an important time in Colombia because since the signing of the 2016 peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC-EP, we have seen the rise of new FARC dissident groups in this region, and indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by their violence, which truly highlights the need to pursue efforts in conflict prevention and resolution directly targeted towards indigenous communities. Next slide, please. So from a methodological perspective, we conducted a series of interviews and focus groups between July 8 and July 11, 2024, with different actors that have visibility on issues of sexual violence and recruitment occurring within this NASA indigenous community. The north of Cauca is the red area you see on the map on the right side of the slide. So we conducted these interviews and focus groups with two different groups specifically. The first group is the NASA Indigenous Guard, which is an non-violent organization led by indigenous people, which establishes order and territorial control within indigenous communities in the region and focuses on the defense of indigenous human rights in the context of the armed conflict in Colombia. The other group we worked with were leaders of the Association of Indigenous Cabildos of Northern Cauca, or the ASIN, which is an association that promotes the political and territorial development of NASA people. And we specifically worked with the women's department of this association, which focuses and addresses cases of violence against NASA women and girls. So given the overall sensitivity of this topic and the potential risks for re-traumatization and extractivist practices, the MAG research team adopted several strategies to ensure that this research was conducted ethically and with cultural sensitivity. And one of those strategies was to implement a robust participatory approach that involved NASA indigenous leaders in each step of our research process, from the formulation of research questions to the design and implementation of methodologies, but also for the co-creation of recommendations to better prevent and address not only sexual violence, but also recruitment within this community. Next slide, please. So in terms of main findings, I'm going to focus on 4 main findings today. I'll quickly go through them and then I'll explain each one of them individually in more detail. So first of all, we did confirm our hypothesis that some survivors of sexual violence in Northern Cauca are indeed joining armed groups in search for justice because the mechanisms available to them in their communities fail to deliver justice and accountability for perpetrators. We see that this phenomenon is happening within a wider context of unequal gender norms and roles within the NASA community. We also found that there are contrasting views between community members regarding the nature and the prevalence of sexual violence. And these contrasting views are undermining efforts to combat the issue. And finally, we found evidence that indicates that not only women and girls, but also men and boys are victims of sexual violence in this community. So now if we look at all of these findings in more detail, next slide, please. We first see that when survivors bring their cases to the indigenous justice system, they frequently face numerous barriers and challenges. They're often faced with often met with skepticism and disbelief, and they often face re-victimization when bringing these cases to the indigenous justice system. And on the other hand, we see that perpetrators often receive very mild penalties or no penalties at all for acts of sexual violence committed, which contributes to a culture of impunity for such crimes and which leaves survivors without adequate support, without assistance, and with no compensation or guarantee of non-repetition for these crimes. If we move to the second slide, to the next slide, we see that sexual violence and the response to it is occurring within a wider context of unequal gender norms and roles between men and women in the community, which is contributing to the lack of recognition of survivors' experiences and contributes as well to the perpetuation of impunity surrounding these cases. We found that most cases of sexual violence were committed by men residing within the homes and within the community, such as family members, neighbors, or members of local authorities. Next slide, please. In addition, our findings also evidence that men and women from the NASA indigenous community hold contrasting views regarding the nature of sexual violence, its prevalence, who the perpetrators are, and its link to joining armed groups. Specifically, we see that men from the community fail to acknowledge existing sexist dynamics occurring within the community. And in relation to sexual violence specifically, they often fail to recognize that this is a serious phenomenon that occurs quite frequently within the community. They tend to attribute instances of sexual violence to factors that are external to the community, such as armed groups, truly downplaying the severity of the issue and overlooking the involvement of local men within sexual violence cases. Generally, this lack of acknowledgement amongst men from the community is problematic because it may contribute to the perpetuation of unequal gender norms and stereotypes, but also to the normalization of sexual violence and to the impunity around these cases. In addition, these contrasting views that I just explained between men and women may also be undermining efforts to combat sexual violence more broadly. Next slide, please. And finally, for our last finding, although most cases of sexual violence in the community are committed against women and girls, we also found evidence that men and boys are also victims of these forms of abuse in the community, which truly highlights that we also need to focus on this population too. And with all these findings in mind, I think it's important to mention that the number of identified cases in this study remains limited, which makes it difficult to ascertain how widespread these findings are in the broader NASA community in Colombia, but also whether this is happening in other indigenous communities in Colombia and beyond. And therefore, we need more research to gain a deeper understanding of this phenomenon and how it's affecting people and specifically indigenous communities, because our findings truly show that there's a disturbing pattern in how failing to address sexual violence can be contributing to conflict dynamics. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, in collaboration with NASA community leaders, we formulated a series of recommendations, both for local institutions and authorities, but also for community members to help reduce instances of sexual violence in the NASA community, to improve outcomes for survivors, and to address some factors that may be contributing to recruitment into armed groups in this community. So if we look at the left of the slide, so the recommendations for local institutions and authorities, we first think it is key to strengthen policy and guidance. This means that we need to effectively socialize current legislation around sexual violence and improve guidance on the effective collection of complaints, monitoring of processes, and resolution of sexual violence cases. Secondly, it is also very important to document and analyze data on sexual violence. This means generating and circulating de-identified and confidential databases on sexual violence cases to evaluate not only the effectiveness of survivors' access to justice, but also potential flaws within the justice system, and in general, adopt measures to improve the quality of support to survivors over time. We also need to build capacity and expand training. This means that we need to enhance the capacity, roles, and work of local institutions in preventing and addressing sexual violence cases. An example for this could be to carry out training sessions periodically with all the actors that are involved in handling sexual violence cases in order to improve the support that we are giving to survivors. And based on our findings, we believe that these trainings must also raise awareness on the existence of sexual violence towards men and boys too, in order to fight against stereotypes that prevent the support for male survivors. Then we have enhancing direct support for survivors. An example for this could be to create a center where survivors can take refuge from the cycles of violence to which they are exposed while receiving different forms of support like psychosocial support, legal support, medical supports, etc. And finally, since our findings show that all of this is happening in a context of unequal gender norms and roles that contribute to the invisibility of sexual violence survivors, it is also important to create a normative campaign to raise awareness on broader sexist dynamics that are occurring within the community, and particularly highlight the occurrence and seriousness of sexual violence. Now, if we look at the right side of the slide, so the recommendations that are directed towards community members specifically, we first encourage community members to report cases of sexual violence. This could be to local authorities and institutions, such as the Indigenous Guard or the Yasin, but also to provide direct support to the survivors in question when possible. We also encourage community members to create a safe space and to be a safe space within the community by respecting the physical and emotional dignity of other community members around them. Since our findings show that sexual violence occurs within a wider context of unequal gender norms and roles, it is also key for community members to denounce instances of machismo and avoid reproducing these kinds of behaviors themselves. In addition, since our findings show that sexual violence mainly occurs within homes and is perpetrated by men that are in general in close proximity to the survivors, it is also key to strengthen family and social networks within the community. And finally, we encourage community members to participate in campaigns against violence organized by community mechanisms, authorities, and institutions to learn how to better prevent sexual violence and how to better support the survivors in question. And beyond all of these recommendations that we co-created with NASA Indigenous leaders, we also co-developed concrete strategies to meaningfully disseminate these findings with community members as part of MAC's and UNIDIR's commitment to give back to the community and to avoid extractivist practices. So for instance, on the 13th of March last month, our team participated in a big assembly organized by the NASA community to raise awareness on gender-based violence within the community, in which approximately 2,000 people participated between NASA authorities, community members, and youth. This event provided a great opportunity for MAC to present our findings to the community and to foster important discussions that could drive meaningful change. In addition to this, to further enhance engagement, MAC also distributed an infographic to the participants that were there at the event, summarizing the key findings and recommendations of our study so that they could take back these infographic with themselves at home. And finally, the team is also currently working on additional material, such as social media posts or step-to-step guides for survivors to better access justice in order to ensure wider dissemination and to continue with this engagement that we have with the community. That's it for the presentation. If we go to the next slide, you will find the QR for this report that I just presented, where you will find in much more detail all these findings and these recommendations that I mentioned today. Thank you very much, and back to Renata.
Thank you very much, Hana and Sofia, for walking us through these different research reports and research projects. And I think like the audience can see these projects, they were conducted in parallel, so they are not, in a way, they are not intentionally very connected, but they both address issues related to international security and sexual violence. And there is a link with armed conflict and weapons. So Hana's presentation at first, provided kind of an overview of how weapons and increased militarization can lead to conflict-related sexual violence. And that is something, that happens around, many conflicts in the world. So it was a broad overview with specific data from specific conflicts. And then Sofia gave us kind of a more in-depth analysis of a specific case, an indigenous community in Colombia, where MEAC and her team was able to do this research, very participatory, very much engaging with people on the ground, and trying to get their views on these issues as well. So I think this is all very valuable, and it connects different levels of knowledge and different levels of analysis as well. Now we have around 15 minutes for, an exchange of views. among all of us who are in this call. So we welcome the input from the audience. If you have questions for Hana, for Sofia about the presentations, we also propose some questions for discussion here in this slide. So for instance, how do these findings apply to your regional realities, but also your national realities? Do you have good practices to share regarding, let's say, data collection on, CRSV incidents, but also support to survivors, for instance, programs aimed at supporting survivors, or strategies to prevent CRSV? Are there new areas for research that could help us better understand the linkages between increased militarization, proliferation of weapons, and sexual and gender-based violence? For instance, Hana mentioned linkages with organized crime, as well with natural resource issues. So there are other things that we could look at in terms of drivers of conflict, drivers of gender-based violence. And how can we enhance support systems such as access to justice, very much an element that Sofia brought for us today about impunity, and how that is also a factor that aggravates the situation. So if we have kind of, increased access to justice, there is a chance that we will move towards a more sustained peace. And then strategies to integrate different perspectives into programs related to prevention and addressing sexual violence. These were some questions that we thought for you today, but this is very much an open Q&A. If you have suggestions for us or questions for the speakers, for instance, questions related to processes taking place in Geneva, multilateral processes taking place in Geneva, such as the Arms Trade Treaty. This is a process that routinely addresses gender-based violence. I mean, it's a part of Article 7.4 to make sure that weapons and equipment being exported will not be used to commit human rights violation. So there, and also maybe in New York, UN Security Council as well. So I would like to stop for now and see if anyone would like to come in and contribute. Please feel free to raise your virtual hand, raise your physical hand, or write in the chat. If people are shy, maybe I will ask a question. For instance, I think I'll ask a question that can go for Sofia and Hana as well. In the process of doing this research, Sofia and Hana, was there anything that you came across that you found surprising, that was, particularly unexpected in terms of, a perspective that you got in touch with, or some sort of data, or some sort of finding? From your perspective, what was the most surprising thing you came across when doing this research?
Should I go first? Yes, I mean, and just to flag that we have Angela Maria in the call as well, who is a part of CORE, which is our implementing partner in Colombia, and she was on the field doing this research. So maybe I can also give her the word afterwards so that she tells us what was surprising for her. But I guess for me, I think this research is very eye-opening because we tend to think, and there's this assumption that conflict-related sexual violence is only perpetrated by armed groups and that that's fueling conflict. But I think in this study, we proved that it can take different forms. So we specifically found that in the NASA community, in the context of the Colombian conflict, this sexual violence is actually committed by community members, not necessarily by armed groups, and that's what's fueling conflict, because the survivors are joining the armed groups in search for justice. So I think this is not a connection that we tend to hear of, and that was very new for us and for other people we've talked to. So I think that for me has been definitely the most interesting thing that we found in our case. But Angela, I would be happy for you to compliment.
Thank you, Sofia. Hi, everyone. My name is Angela Gomez. I'm a researcher at the Conflict Responses Foundation, who is a local partner of MEAC project in Colombia. And yes, we had to experiment some things different for research this kind of topic, because since we're working with indigenous communities, talk about sexual violence is very difficult sometimes. So we have to improve our methodology work. For example, we want to talk about sexual violence inside the community. So that was really heavy topic for the women's survivors. And the finding, the most important finding, was that indigenous survivors, women, were working with armed groups, sometimes because they didn't find any solution inside the community, inside the indigenous law. So that was the very most important finding. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata, for this question. I think that, you know, it's quite like obvious. It's an obvious finding that small arms are related to CRSV, and everybody knew. But what was surprising is that there wasn't any data collected about this, and there wasn't any studies before this one which tried to actually look at the relationship between conflict-related sexual violence and the proliferation of small arms. So the other surprising thing I would say is that practitioners who at the UN or who are working with survivors and victims of conflict-related sexual violence also had very little knowledge about the relationship between small arms and CRSV, and little awareness. They kind of had a feeling, a hunch, but they didn't know how to kind of address the issue of weapons. So I think that was very interesting, because often it just reflects the kind of siloing of this type of work. So often practitioners will be very survivor focused on providing services to the survivors, but the prevention aspect is always secondary. Yeah, I think it was a little bit surprising for me.
No, thank you all for sharing this. And I think, at the end of the day, getting the data and getting the information is very difficult, because as we know, sexual violence remains a hidden issue due to stigma, due to the fact that, as we're talking about CRSV, it happens in the so-called fog of war. And, it's not something that is systematically tracked and reported. And there is also the fact when it happens inside the house, inside the home, it's also something that a lot of people don't feel comfortable reporting or talking about it. So I can only imagine the methodological challenges that Sofia and Angela faced, and I congratulate them for this work, which was done in an ethical and sensitive way. And then also, Hana, our colleagues in the UN, how a lot of the times, in a conflict setting, everybody is working with limited resources and capacity. And sometimes a few things, they don't have the capacity to actually, track and systematize and take a step back to actually connect the dots between different issues. So I find this work very interesting. I would like to highlight to the colleagues joining in the call that there are follow-up projects going on at UNIDIR in this area. Hana is particularly working on a research focused on UN peace operations and how they can improve their work in this area. So yeah, do anyone else have comments or feedback? Or anyone would like to complement what has been said or share ideas for our future work? If not, we may wrap up earlier than we thought. We had thought about staying, from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Geneva time, but it's late in the afternoon here. Maybe we conclude a few minutes earlier. Just to say thank you very much for joining. We will be in touch with information about the recording of the meeting, so you feel free to share it with your network as well. And just say, we always welcome your suggestions and ideas. Feel free to get in touch with us at UNIDIR at any time. With that, thank you very much, Hana, Sofia, Angela, and everyone that joined. I wish everyone a good evening or day or afternoon, depending where you're joining from. Thank you.